Hey everybody, and welcome to week 2 of the Leadership Summer Series, and I'm excited to continue this series. And if you missed week 1, I encourage you to go back, watch week 1, and then join us for week 2. This week we are going to continue in Small Group University. We're going to cover chapter 2, and we're going to jump into Winning with People, covering the first 2 chapters. And I'm going to leave you with some things that we can be focusing our prayer on this week, as well as some practical challenges that I invite you to do. And so let's jump in to Small Group University, Pastor Brad's book. We're going to start in chapter 2, the purpose of small group. And if you've been in small group, which is all of you, you understand and you've started to pick up on what the purpose of small group is and why it exists. And we truly believe that God uses small groups in many different ways. And a couple of the things that we're going to be talking about today come directly from Pastor Brad's book and things that he's written and experienced in his ministry. And so we're going to cover that, but also I was thinking about my own small group experiences, and just 2 years ago Taylor and I, we started a couple small group in our community, and we recognized the reason that we started it originally was because we saw young couples in maybe the same age group or the same life season as us that just didn't have community. And one couple in particular that was going through some really tough times and didn't really have anybody to go through it with them. And so we started a small group with that couple and quickly realized that the need was within us, that we had been kind of going through the motions and we weren't in small group, and a lot of those things that happen in small group weren't happening in our lives, and we didn't realize it until we were back in a small group. And so it was that season of our life that God started to do things in our hearts, in our marriage, and just by doing life with people, celebrating victories, praying together when things were going in a rough way, and God started to move in incredible ways, and it reminded us of why small group is important and why small group exists. And so Pastor Brad, in his book, he covers the 5 primary purposes for small group, and the first purpose is to meet the small group need in people's lives. The small group need, which is basically to say that there are needs that can't be met in the large group Chi Alpha service or even in the church setting, but can only be met in that small group community setting. And it's those needs that when you are in a large group, you can hide, but you can't hide in a small group. And I love that about small group, that you're able to dig deep on an individual level with each person to allow God to minister in an individual way. The second purpose of small group is to provide leadership opportunities. In small group, leadership skills and abilities are developed that might be overlooked in a larger group setting, and so it's important for that. And in a similar way, the third purpose is to develop leaders. We need more leaders to be able to make disciples both in college and beyond. And so we desire our small groups to be a place where leaders are developed and more small group leaders are formed and more disciple makers are made. And the fourth purpose is this: it's to pray for group and individual needs. To pray for those individual needs that when we're at the large group, people aren't able to maybe get the prayer that they desire. And so in a small group, you can really focus on those individual needs more efficiently. And 5, it's to reach pre-Christians. Some of your friends that don't know Jesus might never go to a large group meeting or to a church service, but they will come to a small group setting where you're sitting around in a living room, sitting around in a dorm room, just talking about life. And God can get a hold of their hearts in that place. And so small group is so vital to everything that we do and to what we believe God is calling us to do. And so the question for reflection that I have for you today is this: is how has small group impacted you in your walk with God? Look back in your life. How has small group met a need in your life? And I encourage you to write it down, to share it with somebody. But what I'm really asking you to do is to take a moment and comment in the YouTube comment section or even on the Facebook group, to just share what God has done in your life through small group, so we can all be encouraged and reminded of why we're doing what we're doing. So I encourage you to do that. And now let's jump into Winning with People. And we're going to go over the first 2 chapters just briefly. And so the first 2 chapters are called the lens and the mirror principle. And both of these principles are basically talking about, are we ready for relationship? Are we ready to have a connection with other people? And as small group leaders, it's all about people. It's all about relationship. And so these questions and these principles are really beneficial and helpful to helping us be ready for those small group leading opportunities that we have in the upcoming season of life. And so with the lens principle, it's basically who we are determines the way we see everything, and we cannot separate our identity from our perspective. The things that have happened to us, the things that have made us into the people we are, the experiences that we have, we can't take those things away, and all of those things have contributed to who we are. For me, growing up, my dad was very particular about the things that we did, whether it was mowing the lawn. It had to be like a straight line. We couldn't do the same pattern in back-to-back weeks, and all these things, they were ingrained into me, in my personality and who I am. And so I tend to be very particular about details, and my interns would definitely be able to agree with that statement. And oftentimes I can hurt people, or I can put a wedge in relationship because I see things a certain way that other people don't see. And so I need to allow God to align my perspective with his perspective, and allow myself to be a better communicator and better in relationships with others that aren't like me. And so I encourage you to think through some of those things that your experiences in your life have maybe made it difficult for you to connect with people, and to maybe look at some of the qualities that you desire to have in your own life and in relationships. And maybe even, this is my challenge for you, think about somebody that has those qualities and talk to them, reach out to them and ask them, how do you respond in kindness? How do you respond in love? And I was just meeting with Luke Baker, one of our small group leaders, and Luke and I were talking, and he's a manager over at Chipotle, and he was talking about how he doesn't think he's ever had a disagreement with other people, and that everybody that works for him loves him. And I was saying, how do you do that? How do you go in and deal with people that come from different walks of life and respond in grace and love every time? And it was so much fun to hear his answer. So I encourage you to do things like that. And in the second chapter, the mirror principle, this is basically saying the first person we must examine is ourselves. We remember the story in the Bible where the man is trying to get the speck out of the other person's eye, and Jesus is saying, no, first take the log out of your own eye so that you can help your friend take the speck out of his eye. And so oftentimes the problems that we encounter in relationships are to do with us, and we must examine ourselves first, and we must allow God to bring healing in our hearts and reveal areas in our life that make it difficult for us to connect with other people. And so this chapter allows us to really get real with God and say, God, what areas of my life make it difficult for me to connect with people? And so I encourage you to write some of those things down and just bring them to God and allow him to do a work in your heart. And so those are the chapters for this week. I encourage you to really just get alone with God to process what you're reading and allow him to speak to your heart in a way that makes sense to you. And so pray it out. And so a few of the ways that we're going to pray together this week, we have 3 prayer points. The first prayer point is to pray for your future small group and ask God to give you wisdom in accomplishing his purpose for your small group. So pray for your future small group that God would give you wisdom to accomplish his purpose. The second is that you would pray and ask God to reveal areas in your heart that make it difficult for you to connect with others. So allow God to do that work in your heart. And so pray in that way. And the third way is to pray for boldness and confidence to do what God has called you to do as a small group leader. I know that many of you are probably starting to think like, man, maybe I'm not cut out to be a small group leader. Maybe I don't have what it takes. But I came across 2 Timothy 1:7 where it says, God did not give you a spirit of fear or timidity, but of love, power, and self-control. And so that's what God has given you. And so I pray that into your hearts this week, that you would have boldness and confidence to do all that God has called you to do and to be all that God has called you to be. So I encourage you to take this and run with it. Allow God to speak through what we're reading together, that he would prepare your heart to be a small group leader next fall. But next week, we'll be back, and I encourage you to do the readings. The readings for next week in Small Group University are chapters 3 and 4, Facilitating and Prioritizing Relationships. And those chapters are very short. They're only a couple pages each, so don't be intimidated. And in Winning with People, we're going to do 3 chapters, 3, 4, and 5, which is the pain, hammer, and elevator principles. These are a few of my favorite principles from this book, so I encourage you to read those chapters and come ready to the video to allow God to do something in your hearts. But have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Love you guys.